Great.
So we're recording.
So thank you everyone for joining us. This is the first webinar that ICTM's done in a little while, and we're focusing on the redesigned SAT and what we as math educators need to know. My name is Sendhil Revuluri. I've been on the ICTM board since last October, and you'll also be hearing periodically from George Reese, our president, and most of all from Bill Trapp, who is the person who I think, certainly the person I know who knows the most about the new math SAT and a lot of other math assessments that we know about and wonder about. We're really glad that he's taken some time to share his expertise with us, or at least a tiny slice of the expertise that he has around this topic. And we're going to try and fit as much as we can into this half hour. Bill has also graciously agreed to answer any questions that we don't get to today, probably in writing, in a document that we might be able to share through the ICTM website. And so if you haven't already, this would be a good time to download the handout. On your screen, I'm hoping that you see a PowerPoint slide that shows a link. That is a Google short link. You can download the handout there. You can download the same one handout, just a short 2-page handout, in the GoToWebinar control panel under the Handouts section. If you have any issues with that, please raise your hand in the GoToWebinar interface or type in a question. And we will use that in just a moment. So before we move on to Bill sharing his knowledge with us, I just wanted to share a little general context here. As I mentioned, I'm Sendhil Revuluri. I'm Director at Large of ICTM, and Bill Trapp is who we're mainly going to be hearing from. He's the Executive Director of Mathematics and Science Assessment at the College Board. If I got that title wrong, he will correct me in a moment. We thought that there would be a way to have you chat back to us, but we are learning that on GoToWebinar that's a little trickier than we thought. But just from seeing some names I know folks are with us from north and south and everywhere in between, which is great. We'll go until 4 o'clock, and then Bill is able to stay a little bit for some Q&A. And as we mentioned a moment ago, in case you weren't with us yet, this webinar is being recorded, but since you don't have audio, I don't think that'll make much difference to you, but we thought we should let you know. And one thing that we'd really like to request, especially as we are restarting our webinar series after some time, if you could please take a minute or two to answer some brief questions in the survey that'll pop up after you disconnect from the webinar, that'd be extremely helpful to us, and so we would appreciate that feedback. So we're going to start with some samples. There are 2 sample items on the first page of the handout. Again, there's a link in the GoToWebinar control panel, and there's also a link in this slide that you are looking at. Please take a few minutes. It might get a little quiet, but please take a few minutes to work these 2 sample items. And if you have some more time before I move us along, take a moment and think about the questions on the next page of that handout. And we'll discuss each of those items and questions in just a moment. So for those who are just joining, just a couple quick notes. If you are having any trouble downloading the handout, either from the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel or from this link, please type in a question. And just so you know, this is being recorded, though you are not on audio, so it probably doesn't make a big difference to you. So we're going to take a look at these two items in a moment. Before we go there, just want to make sure you know that you are able to put in questions at any point. We will probably not take your question that instant, but we would like to have the questions so we can get some of them addressed during our 30 minutes. As we mentioned before, Bill has graciously agreed to both stay with us past 4 o'clock and to answer questions that we don't get to in a bit later in writing. So it would be really great to get those questions from you through the GoToWebinar interface. So let's take a look. The first sample item that you saw in the handout is also visible on this slide. I know at least one person had some issues displaying the item. Sorry about that, but hopefully you can see it now. And what would be great to know is what your thoughts are on any of the points that are on the second part of the handout. What do you notice and what do you wonder about the item, about the mathematics, or about anything else? So please go ahead and put your thoughts into the questions dialog, and I'll share some of the themes that come out. So a couple people have brought up the fact that the language here is notable. I think the point is that it is more complex, longer, some say wordier. Another person said there are some significant language considerations. And it's not necessarily what students are used to or what we are used to. Some other folks noted that the mathematics here is about finding the equation of a line given what they have boiled down to being 2 points, but it's asked in a different way. And so it's about writing an equation and not solving an equation. Someone else pointed out that this is not guessable using a simple strategy of looking for what numbers are in the item and looking for those numbers in the options. And one or two people noted also that these are, this is a real-world context, maybe not one that seems super authentic to students, but it is a real-world context, and that I think is also notable. So, as you look at this more, we would encourage you to look at this item and really all the resources with colleagues when you get a chance, and we'll tell you how to find those. You may have more thoughts about that. The second item is now hopefully on your screen, and it may provoke some of the same thoughts. It may also make you think some other things. So I'll give you a minute again to put your thoughts about this sample item number 2 into the questions dialog box. So a couple thoughts coming in. Some people are noticing that some of the same issues, that there is a lot of reading compared to items that we might be used to. The kind of cognition that's being requested is not about interpretation or explanation, though. It's really about solving a problem, answering a question. That question, a lot of people are noting, is very multi-step. They also have noted that there are a lot of units to keep track of. It's not just one conversion. There's at least 2 conversions, I think people have noted. And students have to understand the relationship between like-kind units and the rate in the context. And there's also some more thought about how the context is selected and how that matters for students, for assessing their understanding and why those might have been chosen. And I know Bill will have some thoughts for us on the larger context. So we thought we'd start with these couple items because for me, I started thinking about these questions really when I started participating in the item review process for the new SAT, and noted that the items looked a lot different from what I was noticing on assessments that I saw in schools, and also trying desperately to remember 20 plus years back when I took the SAT, which wasn't really very fruitful, but some things that I noticed that were kind of interesting. And so these are some questions that we thought might be valuable, not just for these items, but for any time you look at any kind of mathematical task that your district is using, your colleagues are using, your classroom is using, to think about, what is the mathematics here? What kind of thinking is requested? And what are some implications for our instruction? And so we'll be making these slides available afterwards, and so these might be helpful to refer to later. But I'm now going to hand off to Bill, who will give us a little more information about the broader context and tell us some more about the key changes and the motivation for those changes.
Thank you, Sendhil, and thanks again for participating in our committee reviews. We have a large number of teachers across the country that participate in item and form reviews for us, and Sendhil has just begun participating and gets to see the interesting things that people say, and he gets to see how well we listen. And I hope that we listen well to all of our participants. And so today, I thank you for coming, and I hope that you get something useful out of this. And again, please, like he said, ask questions through the chat, and I'm happy to answer things during if I can, or definitely afterwards. There's not much I can talk about in 15 minutes, but I will go as quick as I can, and know that that you can always reach out to Sendhil as a participant in our committees to get feedback on questions, or just ask questions to him, and he can relay them to me. So we encourage you to share this information and use it to prepare your students and also to get the data from the test. Some people think that the SAT data is really only for colleges and they use it for admissions, but you have access to that data as high school teachers, and you can look and see how students did, and you can, and the thing I like to look at is, did students perform as you expected they would have performed? And not students in general, I'm talking about the students you know. You know how well Sally can do on your classroom assessments. Is she going to do the same, or is she doing at the same level on the SAT or the PSAT 10 or the PSAT 8-9? So we have the 3 tests, and I want to make these connections. Sendhil thought it was important to share these connections, that the SAT is the test you take typically at junior year. It's used for college admissions, but the PSAT, NMSQT, and the PSAT 8-9 have also been redesigned and are based on the same content. It's based on the same backbone of standards, just less rigor, less content, less depth and breadth as you go down. There's 38 questions on 8-9, there's 48 questions on PSAT and MSQT, and there's 58 questions on the SAT. So they help, they connect to each other, and they help you prepare. On the next slide, this is just a reminder that the scale is changing. So the redesigned SAT that began the first administration was in March of this year. The math score is reported on the scale of 200 to 800, which is different from previous administrations. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk in more detail about these things, but these are 8 key changes that we've been talking about since 2014, and I'll talk about more of them on the next slides. But in Math That Matters Most, I'm talking about the reporting areas of Heart of Algebra, problem solving and data analysis, and Passport to Advanced Math, along with additional topics in math. And then problems grounded in real-world context. Those are, the 2 examples that Sendhil showed. They definitely show rich applications. We aim for applications that are interesting, that help students get into the content. We don't want contrived context, but it's kind of hard to avoid. We really struggle, and our committees help us write better items with better context. But again, we really rely on our committees to help us decide whether something is appropriate for the population or not. The whole test is not made up of problems grounded in real-world context. There's also fluency items, which really focus on, can students just do the procedures that they've been taught, and can they do them fluently and quickly, and also do they have conceptual understanding of the things that they've learned. And on this slide, you'll notice the reporting areas are Heart of Algebra and problem solving and data analysis. There's 19 questions in Heart of Algebra. There's 17 questions in problem solving and data analysis. There's a calculator and no calculator portion. We've been getting feedback on that from the recent administrations. The Passport to Advanced Math section, it's not in the little red box, but there's 16 items in that, and students get a score based on that. They do not get a score based on additional topics in math. There's not enough questions in that section to provide a sub-score. But that's kind of an overview of how the content is broken out. Let me dig in a little bit on the content on this next slide. So the questions in each of the areas, they span the full range of difficulty and address relevant practices, fluency, and conceptual understanding. Students will be asked to analyze, fluently solve, create linear equations and inequalities, demonstrate reasoning about ratios, rates, and proportional relationships, interpret and synthesize data, identify quantitative measures of center, look at deviations from the overall pattern in data sets, in 1 or 2 different data sets, consider the effects of outliers on a data set, solve quadratic and higher order equations in 1 variable, and understand the graphs of those functions. They'll have to interpret and build functions. So I'm rambling off a few things. Let me get a little bit more organized and talk just about Heart of Algebra on this next slide. When we
Bill,
review,
can I jump in with one quick point? A couple
Sure.
of people are asking if we can distribute this information. This is all information that's been publicly released by the College Board, and we'll be sharing the URLs to get you there before we leave today. But if you just go to the College Board site, you'll find it pretty quickly. Sorry, Bill, go ahead.
And And if you're having trouble finding it, just ask, and I will point you to specific places in those documents so you don't have to spend hours looking for it. So on the next slide, when we get into Heart of Algebra here, when committees get together and we talk about specific items and we say, is this a question that belongs on the SAT? The first thing we look at is, does it fit in one of our big categories, which is linear equations in one variable, linear equations in two variables, linear functions, systems of linear equations in two variables, and inequalities. And all of the items in Heart of Algebra should focus in one of those areas. And it's an attempt to really narrow down exactly what's most important for students to know, so that when students do well, that they're likely to perform well in a variety of college majors and or careers if they decide to go out of high school into a career, and that if students don't do well, they still have time in high school to look back and say, what should I focus on to improve in, and not try to relearn all of Algebra 1 or not try to redo all of geometry. Within each of those areas, we want students to demonstrate that they can create equations and use them. So they may be given a problem-solving situation and be asked to solve that problem, and they may not know that in their head they're creating an equation and solving it, but they're going to do the steps they would have done in order to do that very thing. The first example Sendhil showed was a question we would classify as identify. We expect students to be able to look at a situation and identify an equation that represents that situation. In some cases, we give students an equation and we ask them to interpret part or all of the equation. We want students to make connections between the equations and different representations, and sometimes make interpretations between an equation and its context. And then also I'm talking about a lot of things that are in context, but there are several items on the test that have no context around them at all. We want students to demonstrate that they can fluently solve equations and systems of equations. In problem solving and data analysis, this is another big chunk of the test on the next slide. There's a large focus across several different areas. I'm just going to list them off, but the specifications that are online get into more detail. But there's things like ratios, rates, proportions, and units, and percents. And those are questions that we wish would be easy for students, especially 11th graders, but many students struggle on those questions. And that's a good place. That's a good place where we have history, history-based questions or social studies-based questions and science-based questions, because we want those science teachers and social studies teachers to be watching out for students who struggle with simple math concepts like ratios. If they're struggling and applying those in their upper level science and social studies classes, it would be nice if the math teacher knew, so that they could check and see if it was just a one-time thing or whether there is an issue, because there's questions out there that students will use, not just on the SAT, but when they get into college. So ratios, rates, proportions, units, percents, several questions on the SAT will cover those. And they fall mainly in the middle school standards when you look at a lot of the state standards that are out there, but they're worth making sure students can do before they move into any kind of degree program at college. We also ask questions about univariate data, bivariate data, simple probability, and some statistics questions. And again, more detail about exactly what kinds of questions are on the website in the test specifications, but it's an attempt to narrow down what's being asked so that when students do well on it, it shows that they're likely to succeed when they see that content again in college, or when they're working on coursework that builds upon that knowledge. And when students don't do well on it, it's well worth the time of that student and the tutor or the teacher to go back and cover those concepts again in more detail. And not try to, like I said before, not try to reteach all of Algebra 1 or all of Algebra 2. The next slide is kind of a place to prompt you for some feedback here, because some of these things you may have heard before, some of them you may not have heard with this connection to the math content, but there are implications for instructions. there are implications for what your classroom tests may look like, or what you may your quizzes. There's things to think about in terms of what do you focus on during the year, cognitive demand, other assessments that you have to take. How does this match up with them? Is this supporting what you're doing? Is this totally different and you can't really cover the content in both? So Sendhil, what are you hoping here for, that people reply in the chat with some thoughts?
Well, especially given our time, these are more to plant some seeds for you. We would strongly encourage you to use not just the 2 items we shared, but all the sample items that the College Board has released, and have some conversations within your department, within your school, within your network, and think about this. In particular, one thing that I found really striking and have talked about with a few people already is that this is not something that is just of relevance or just of interest or just the responsibility of high school teachers. A lot of the content standards here, as Bill mentioned, in the Common Core, they live in that really important ratio and proportional thinking domain, which is in the middle grades. But it's really important for college readiness. And so a lot of what Bill is saying and the rationale the College Board has used sounds really familiar to me, having listened to the Common Core lead authors talk about how they decided what should go into the standards. And if you have thoughts, please do put them in the questions window. And even if we don't get to them in the next 3 minutes, Bill's going to be with us a little longer, and hopefully some of you can be with us as well. There are some things that came from the College Board, from Bill's team, that I thought were really consistent with stuff that we've been doing with teachers and with districts in the last few years. And they sound like they're the kind of instruction that leads to students actually understanding math, which I'm certainly in favor of. And so, when the SAT, sort of the official word is also that students discuss how they arrive at solutions, that they think about expressing relationships in words, and that they practice solving multi-step problems. That, I think, is a really good reinforcer for challenges that I feel like many colleagues have shared with me, that they're wondering, how do I make this case to parents, to my administrators, and so on. And just to sort of give us some other ideas before we transition to the Q&A phase, we also are sharing another slide from the College Board resources, and these I thought were pretty interesting recommendations as far as the kinds of instructional experiences that help students learn, that looking at worked examples and identifying errors, correcting those errors, and discussing their thinking is really valuable. Having them think about different things other than just driving for a numerical answer, to organize their information, to make other representations, and to justify answers as well as just finding an answer. Before we wrapped up, Bill is going to share a little bit about how the other assessments at other grade levels fit in with the SAT itself.
So the PSAT 8-9, again, like I said before, is based on the same content base as the PSAT, NMSQT, and the SAT. It's just not as wide and as deep as the content that's covered. It's normed for 9th graders, so it's, we can't ask some of the geometry-based questions or some of the Algebra 2-based questions that we would, and we've also reduced the level of content in the Heart of Algebra questions that we would ask too. So again, just reducing that breadth and depth to be more appropriate for what they've already seen. And the same is true on the next slide for PSAT 10 and PSAT NMSQT. And the difference between these two tests is minimal. It's just the time of year when they're administered. The NMSQT, the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, is only given in the fall, I believe. Maybe it's the spring now. I'm blanking on that. But the test is offered 2 times a year, so only once does it count for the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. Here the content is a little bit broader than 8-9 and a little bit deeper, and not as deep as SAT, not as broad as SAT, but getting close. There's still, with 10 questions fewer than SAT, PSAT can't cover what needs, what you would on the SAT. So this slide again gives some good examples. I'm not going to read any of this to you, and you'll be able to receive this PowerPoint too. And then on the next slide, you've got some resources, some additional resources. I'm guessing that's a hyperlink to the test specifications, which will be helpful.
Yep. And so the URL you see at the bottom, which I'll also put in the chat window, just so you don't have to copy it down, is sort of the place where you'll find all the stuff that the College Board has released publicly. I've bugged Bill with questions, and basically he said it's all there, and the other stuff I can't tell you anyway. So that's a really good place to look. They've also organized some nice PD modules. We've actually adapted several of the slides that we've been using from those PD modules, specifically number 4 and number 5. And then there are a couple short documents. This one, The Math That Matters Most, is, I think, a really good summary of what Bill has said with a little more detail about the rationale for those decisions. And then there's also a test specifications document that has some questions that other people have been wondering. So with that, we know some folks have to go at 4, and so we want to thank you for being here today. Just one plug, if you're not already a member of ICTM, please join us. You support efforts like these, our annual conference, and a lot of other things that really promote high-quality math education in Illinois. We thank those of you who are members for making this possible. And when you do log off, you will get a short survey, and we would really, really appreciate your responses to those questions. We've had a few questions come in, and we wanted to take those, and then I would welcome any more questions that you can put in through the questions window. So one question, and I will ask them to Bill, just keep things separately. Sorry, keep things a little simpler than trying to unmute people one by one. One person has wondered, is there a maximum number of geometry questions on each form of the SAT?
That's a conversation, or that's a question that's come up a lot. It's more, the question is usually phrased in, hey, where did the geometry go? But I will try to answer that. So the maximum number of geometry questions, when we talk about geometry-based questions, there are questions on the test which you really cannot answer unless you've had a rigorous geometry education. Not to say that you've had a full year of geometry. I mean, we can't test everything that you would cover in a year of geometry, but there are certain specifications that if you're in a traditional Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2 course, anywhere between 4 and 6 questions on the test will come from your experiences in that geometry course. But one of the guiding principles of the SAT is that an advanced math education, and again, whether that advanced math is taking geometry and algebra 2 or pre-calc or calculus, that advanced math benefits you and gives you more connections and more ways to solve problems on the SAT. So although there's 4 to 6 geometry-based questions on the test, there's several questions which, if you've taken geometry, you have multiple pathways to pursue the solution to. It just gives you more ways of approaching and more entry points of getting at that context, or of that content.
So I think that was the official answer, right, Bill?
I'm happy to clarify anything, but yeah.
Okay, so yeah, if you have more questions on that or anything else, please keep them coming. We have a few already on deck here. One question asks, as Illinois high school students transition, many from taking the ACT to taking the SAT, what would you say are the biggest differences between those two assessments in terms of mathematics content?
It's really hard for me to talk to that because I took the ACT, what, 20-some years, 25 years ago, and I remember it, and it has changed since then. But the people on my team that were teachers more recently than I was really recall, the ACT being a test that you should know the content specifications for, you should have a good sense, and you should be, helping students. Not that test prep is necessary, but there's a lot of things covered on it, and if you don't read the test specifications, you're probably going to miss something that's covered on it. So I think a big difference here is that the pieces that you would see assessed on the SAT are the things that you would hope would be there and that you wouldn't have to go out of your way to make sure you cover. There's just a narrower focus. The other thing is the variety of the questions. The ACT is 60 questions in 60 minutes, and those questions have to be short and they have to be solvable quickly. The SAT has got a no calculator section, which is 20 questions in 25 minutes, which again is fast, but those are fluency type, a lot of fluency and a lot of conceptual questions that shouldn't require a lot of calculation. But then in the calculator section, you've got 38 questions in 55 minutes. You're going to see a little bit more context. You're going to see a little bit more variety and difficulty. And in both of those sections, you're going to see both multiple choice and gridded response type questions. So there's quite a few things that are different. And on that earlier slide, we talked about how does this test format impact instruction? How does the test content impact instruction? And there's things to consider for both of those.
And if anyone has recent experience with the ACT and can shed any light on that question, that would be great. Just go ahead and submit it as a question, even though it's more of an answer. Sort of a related question has come up. Some folks are wondering about the percentage of students in Illinois who take the SAT now and how that might change in the near future. And Bill, I don't know if you know about what's going on in Illinois, but again, if anyone else knows about that, please feel free to share.
That is not something that I would know off the top of my head because I really focus on test content here. But we have a great team. I'm out of the Chicago office, and we have a great team here that travels across the state to assist with, understanding the data, getting ready for the changes in the SAT, and they are people that I can go to, right outside my door and talk to about that question. So I'll be glad to respond to that question in the written response.
Great. So one more in the content domain. Do you feel that there are specific high school courses that best align to the expectations of the Math SAT?
That's kind of a loaded question there. Math courses have changed so much in the past few years. I got out of teaching in 2001. Things were changing then. Things changed very much as No Child Left Behind evolved. And now we're in 2016, and people were getting ready for PARCC and SBAC tests, and they were adjusting their classroom assessments and their curriculum focuses to accommodate that. And now, the SAT is basically, the College Board in the development of the redesigned SAT is saying you're probably covering what you need to be covering to help students get college and career ready. There shouldn't be a need to add coursework, and there's certainly paths that students will take where they don't need a rigorous mathematical education. And I hate to say that, but there's students who go into certain fields just don't need all the math we wish that all students had. So are there certain courses that will help? Well, sure. If you are familiar with your curriculum in your school and you look at the test specifications, the tables that talk about the content are pretty clear and pretty short and concise. You should quickly see which things you think are, which things you are pretty sure are taught in which courses, and you'll see which connect, to both. We're not, it's not going to be that, hey, you need to have AP Calculus or that you need to have any kind of pre-calculus, really. Not that those won't benefit you, but again, there's a focus on the math that matters most for students to be college and career ready. And that doesn't mean AP Calculus for everyone. I'm going to say unfortunately following that, and some of you will agree with that and disagree with that.
Sure. So a follow-up question was, it seems like the content that you described is more Algebra 1 than Algebra 2. Is that a fair description, or is that a hard question to answer?
I would say that the heart of algebra is really, you know, if I can say Algebra 1 and it meant the same thing to all of us, which I know it doesn't, the heart of algebra is a large piece of Algebra 1. Passport to Advanced Math includes some things you would expect to see in Algebra 1 also, which means automatically, yeah, the test is going to feel more like Algebra 1 than Algebra 2. So I'm using these terms, and I'm assuming, I'm not assuming, I'm telling you, I know that we all don't agree on what Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 are anymore, but hopefully you can understand that, you know, traditionally what would have been, what we would think of as what's covered in Algebra 1 and what's covered in Algebra 2, we should have a firm enough ground where I can say those things and we would all agree, yeah, that there's a good chunk of the test that's Algebra 1 and there's a good chunk of the test that's Algebra 2, but certainly not as much.
So this is entirely my professional opinion, but not one of any organization that I'm affiliated with, certainly not on the College Board. I think in addition to the content, I think looking at these items is a really good way to provoke conversation and to provoke thinking about the kind of understanding that kids need. Besides the content area or the specific function families or whatever that is, the kind of understanding that kids need to demonstrate on SAT items now. Just to close the loop on one thing, Jennifer helpfully gave us an answer that about 5% of graduating Illinois seniors in 2015 took the SAT. And my understanding is we should expect that to go up given that the state is transitioning from the Prairie State to the SAT in the coming years. One related question that came up was about SAT compared to PARCC. And one person wondered, the focus areas of the SAT seem similar to those on PARCC, and so is preparing students for PARCC also adequately preparing them for SAT?
That's another loaded question there. I recently, I lost track of PARCC for a little while, and very recently needed to go back and connect and answer a similar question for someone. And I found it very challenging to identify resources on the web that I could trust. I found it difficult to find like a sample test and a description of exactly what the student experience is, and also what students take which test and when and what year. So I unfortunately, if my research, you know, and this was just a few weeks ago, if I had found out more information, I would be speaking to this, I would be answering this question very, very clearly and concisely, but I just don't know enough about PARCC and specifically about the assessment and what's covered on the assessment to tell you whether or not preparing for PARCC prepares you for the SAT. I would say probably, but I would also imagine that PARCC again covers such a large swath of the math content, especially the content, you know, in the massive high school state standards in Illinois, that there's going to be things covered on PARCC that you would never see on the SAT. The sample questions that I saw on PARCC had much heavier context, much more set-based items. I don't know that the items were based upon each other. I don't think that was a characteristic, but it felt very different from the SAT. So if I was preparing students for the PARCC and preparing students for the SAT, I would do similar things, but I would certainly do some things for PARCC that I wouldn't do for SAT, I guess. And again, I'm not very confident in that answer because I really didn't find a good sample test. And like Sendhil said, the best thing that I can do to get a sense of how they're going to, you know, they will say, here's what we're going to assess. You know, this test is based on the Illinois state standards, and I can look at those and I can say, okay, I understand what might be covered on here, and then I can look at a sample test and I can get a sense of, what emphasis are they going to give to different areas of those standards? And since I wasn't able to find a good example of that, I wasn't able to find a good practice test, I can't really speak to what kind of preparation would be good for PARCC versus SAT.
And so one question that I think might bridge the gap a little bit, did your team reference the Common Core state standards when developing the SAT? And if so, is there some kind of alignment to the Common Core state standards that is available?
Well, that's a dangerous question too. When we built the SAT, and I wasn't here for the very beginning when the conversations were started, but basically all of the state standards that were available at that time, not just considering I mean, at that time, this was what, 3 or 4 years ago, the Common Core was really being adopted by many states. But there were also some holdouts that said we will probably never ever go to the Common Core, and we either like our standards as they are, or we're going to modify them to capture some of the things that we do like about Common Core, but certainly not, you know, overhaul them to look like the Common Core. So there's always going to be states that tweak what they're given, and also states that won't adopt anything that's national too. So the Common Core was certainly part of our consideration of, you know, the effort that went into that and the research that went into the Common Core. What can we learn from that, and how can we focus the testing into that math that matters most? And when you look at the alignment, it is a close alignment, and it's a close alignment with every state standard set, because we're looking at the core that we pretty much would all agree is here's what students should know by the time that they're ready to enter a credit-bearing course in college. There is an alignment document. We provide an alignment document to every single state, and I know we did one for Illinois, and I don't know who gets that or how you get your hands on that. It's given, I'm certain it's given to the Department of Education, and I've never seen one published on the Department of Education website. I've never seen it come up if I attend a Department of Education meeting. But that document does exist. I am certainly not allowed to distribute it to anyone if the Department of Education doesn't want to share it. But that's where I would reach out to for that document.
And so I know a number of people who are on this webinar have close connections with ISB, so maybe someone can investigate that question. Again, my 2 cents, my professional opinion is that looking at a crosswalk, looking at an overall alignment document is probably less informative than looking more deeply at fewer items. And I think from the items I've looked at with several groups of people, the consensus is that in spirit and in terms of the cognition that we're asking students to engage in, both PARCC and the SAT are pretty consistent in their view. They assess them differently. The items are certainly not all the same kinds of items, but the changes about having more reading comprehension, having more multi-step problems, having higher demand kinds of items are all pretty consistent, and they just sort of are instantiated differently in each assessment. So in terms of instruction, the consensus of the groups we talked with was really that they may not be exactly the same. The SAT may be a more focused domain in terms of content, as a couple people have mentioned in the questions and answers that they've brought in just now, but they're pretty similar in spirit. Again, that's my opinion, not speaking for the College Board. There's a couple of questions, and people have been waiting patiently about them. They're related, and they're really good questions. Coming from the higher ed perspective, from colleges and community colleges. And the questions relate to really interpreting the SAT results for college and community college faculty. How would they find information about interpreting those results, and in particular, using SAT results for placement in math courses in higher ed?
That is a great question that has a huge answer to it. And I think I should respond to that written, in a written format.
Is there a document that people might be able to find?
Yeah, I don't know, but again, there's so many. That's a big question, and that's a question you would ask and I would expect to hear some follow-up questions based on the answer too. So let me try to answer that in a written format, and whoever asks can feel free to reach out to me, or I can direct them to a person to ask follow-up questions.
Great, thanks, Bill. And then that sort of connects to a general question about reports, which is sort of just wondering, what's the level of detail in those reports?
So
do you want me to go back to our slide?
No, a slide. I don't have a really good report screenshot to share, unfortunately. But students are going to get, a Heart of Algebra score, a Passport to Advanced Math score, a problem solving and data analysis score, an overall math score, and then their combined score for math and reading, writing, language. So all of that information is in the score, and you can use it to diagnose. You can use it to, the question about placement, the question about college admissions. Colleges are asking all of that information. It's all helpful to look at and figure out, what can I do with this and what's the best way to use this data. There's some norm reference data in there too. I will see if I can find a link to some report samples.
Okay. So we're coming up on about 20 minutes of questions in addition, and I know some people have had to sign off. Why don't I put out sort of a last call for questions to be answered now, as much as Bill is able to. And I will keep an eye on the GoToWebinar for that. So seeing no additional questions, though a few people said thanks, I think we will wrap this up for now. As mentioned earlier, the session has been recorded, and we will be making that available through the ICTM website in some way in the near future. We'll also make sure that you get a PDF of the slides that we shared today for everyone who is registered. And if you have additional questions, feel free to contact me, and I can relay them to Bill. That's my email address, and we appreciate you being here. Just one final reminder and request that when you leave this webinar, you will get a short survey. Hopefully it'll just take you a minute, maybe two, and we would really, really appreciate your responses to that survey. They'll be extremely helpful. And if you have ideas about future webinar topics or formats or anything else, please do mark that question on the survey and feel free to send me an email. So thank you very much, and we will see you in October in Peoria, I hope, and see you in person some other time as well.
Thank you all very much.